and welcome to the lineup. Today is August the 26th, 2021. I'm Barry Stagner. Just a little note before we jump in, especially if you may be joining us for the first time. Someone made a comment last week on our YouTube broadcast. Why don't you just teach instead of reading the news? Well, listen, there's a lot of junk out there. There's a lot of garbage to filter through. And some of the stuff is just non factual and some of it's sensational. And certainly not all of it is true. We know there's an agenda with the media today. And so, my hope during this program is for us to kind of wade through some of the stories, filter out some of the things that simply are non factual or ideologically based, and talk about things as they relate to Bible prophecy. If you'd like to watch teaching, you can go right to the YouTube channel, and there are literally hundreds of messages that you can watch there. I think I've got some 600 messages on there, something like that. And there's certainly plenty of other good teachers out there. So if you're after teaching, that's not what this program is all about. I love to teach the Bible, but I also like to stay on top of what's happening out there in the world. So, again, welcome to the program and interesting things happening today. And I want to talk about what everybody's thinking about and how our hearts are all gripped about what's going on in Afghanistan and the multiple explosions and gunfire that was at the Kabul airport today. And I'm not going to mention any numbers because the numbers keep changing. I've read things all over the map. But what we do know today for sure, according to the Associated Press, is that U.S. personnel were among casualties after the explosions at the Kabul airport. Multiple explosions outside the airport Thursday resulted in a number of U.S. and civilian casualties as the U.S. is working to rapidly evacuate Americans and Afghan allies from Afghanistan, the Pentagon confirmed Thursday. There have been, at least reported by Fox News and others, at least 3 U.S. Marines are among the injured. I read another article that said that there were 6, one of them seriously. Now, we can confirm, the article goes on to say, that the explosion at the Abbey Gate was the result of a complex attack that resulted in a number of U.S. and civilian casualties, according to Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby. We can also confirm at least one other explosion at or near the Barron Hotel, a short distance from the Abbey Gate. And U.S. intelligence officials are operating under the assumption that the attacks at the Kabul airport Thursday were carried out by ISIS, giving their motive and general threat intelligence received in recent weeks and days. A senior U.S. Intelligence official who spoke on the condition of anonymity said the intelligence community has made no specific or formal attribution that the attacks were ISIS, noting it's certainly something that they would gain a lot from doing. And this is a perfect opportunity for them to stick it to the Taliban, stick it to us, and gain a national stage to show that they're still out there, as all terrorist groups want to do, the official noted. The official also said he could not discuss the particulars of the intelligence that led the Biden administration to urge Americans to evacuate the airport, but said those warnings from State Department and White House were prompted by recently gathered information provided by the CIA and other U.S. intelligence services. We know there's been a backlash and an outcry against the president of his handling, or bungling, I should say, of the evacuation of Americans and our allies there in Afghanistan. This very group that we went to Afghanistan to combat and defeat is now back in charge of the country, just a matter of days after the U.S. began to pull troops out or make that announcement. And the whole country has now fallen under the rule of the Taliban. So interesting times in which we live. And we made the point last week why this is prophetically applicable, possibly, is because we know that one of the nations that's named in the Ezekiel war, that being Togarmah, we're told that in Ezekiel 38:8, many other nations are with you. And that word nations, or many other people, are with you. And that word people actually means tribes. And Afghanistan, obviously being a tribal country, could very well be involved in the Ezekiel invasion. So we do know, even though there's animosity between the Taliban and other groups and like ISIS, the reality is they all share one common hatred, and that is the hatred of the nation of Israel. Now, Breitbart says that we have surrendered. Anthony Blinken says U.S. must get Taliban permission in order to evacuate Americans. Now, let me just say this. I saw an article the other day and some film footage of the Russians who also had a presence in Afghanistan but pulled out. And I think the interesting thing about that particular news footage was they took their equipment with them. They didn't leave behind attack helicopters and Humvees and small arms and all the other things that were left behind by the Biden administration so they could be used against our people and our troops. And again, and to say nothing about the poor Afghani people who have enjoyed 20 years of a little bit more of a Western culture and a liberated state out from underneath the pressures of the Taliban. And now this has been reversed in just a matter of days. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken did not deny that the U.S. must ask the Taliban for permission to get Americans out of Afghanistan during an interview over the weekend, days before President Joe Biden caved to jihadist August 31st evacuation deadline. Blinken made it clear on Sunday that the Taliban is calling the shots. Now, when you're the greatest superpower in the world, you don't have people call the shots for you. You go in and you take what's yours and get out. This is just ridiculous and an embarrassment for the U.S. and the international community, which we'll talk about that in a few moments. We certainly don't bow down and submit to a group of people like this who are already killing Christians. We've had multiple reports. If anyone has on their personal documents the label Christian, they're immediately killed. If anyone is found with a Bible app on their phone, they are immediately killed. The women's schools have all been burned down, and the girls' schools and all that. We've already heard all these heinous stories on what in the world is the U.S. administration doing, bowing to the needs of or demands of the Taliban. You tell the Taliban what you're going to do. You don't ask them what you're going to do. And during the latest edition of CBS's Face the Nation, host Major Elliot Garrett questioned Blinken over the administration's disastrous handling of the Afghanistan withdrawal, which led to the Taliban taking control of the country and declaring victory from Kabul on August 15th. Garrett asked, someone in our audience might listen to you, Mr. Secretary, and say, oh, so we have to ask the Taliban for permission for American citizens to leave, true or not true? Blinken's reply, they are in control of Kabul. That is the reality, and that's the reality we have to deal with. Garrett followed up with, how comfortable are you with that, Mr. Secretary? To which he replied, what I'm focused on, what we're all focused on, is getting people out and making sure that we're doing everything possible to do that. And in this case, I think a requirement of the job is to be in contact with the Taliban, which controls Kabul. Blinken responded. And echoing other Democrats, Representative Tom Malinowski, Democrat from New Jersey, House Foreign Affairs Committee member, noted that Blinken and top military officials have conceded that completing evacuations by August 31st is unrealistic. So if you don't get out by the 31st, basically the U.S. administration has said, we're going to go say pretty please to the Taliban to see if we can get the rest of you out. And the number of Americans still there, numbers in the thousands. And why in the world would the U.S. leave our people or other support personnel or those who have allied with us to fight against the Taliban behind, to say nothing about the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment that has been left behind? Now, the New York Post says, Blinken says up to 1,500 U.S. citizens still stranded in Afghanistan. The number is far higher than that, as Biden laughs off the question. That's why I wanted to cover this story. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on Wednesday said that up to 1,500 U.S. citizens are still stranded in Afghanistan shortly after President Biden joked with a reporter who asked about possibly leaving Americans behind in the Taliban-controlled nation. Blinken gave the figure after U.S. officials repeatedly said they don't know how many Americans remain in Afghanistan as Biden prepares to remove all troops in just days to adhere to an August 31st deadline. And again, this deadline was set by the Taliban. Now, among those still stranded in Afghanistan are 24 school aged children and 16 parents from Southern California who took a trip to the war torn country to visit their extended families over the summer and have reportedly been trying to make their way to the Kabul airport to get on evacuation flights while they still can. And Blinken, meanwhile, said there is no deadline for evacuating citizens because the Taliban, listen to this, the Taliban gave assurances that Americans and at risk Afghans can leave even after the U.S. troops are gone. What in the world is the Secretary of State doing putting trust in a group like this that kills Christians, belittles and abuses women, all these other things we see going on? And yet, our administration is going to take them at their word. He goes on to say there's no deadline on our work to help any remaining American citizens who decide they want to leave to do so, along with many Afghans who have stood by us over these many years and want to leave and have been unable to do so. He went on to say the Taliban have made public and private commitments to provide and permit safe passage for the Americans, third country nationals, and Afghans at risk going forward past August 31. Now, the thing that I don't think that Blinken or Biden or anybody else in that administration seems to understand, that according to Islam, if it furthers your cause, you're free to lie. And we've seen this proven time and again with other radical and extremist groups. And there's even a practice, a label for it. It slips my mind at the moment within Islam, that you can tell a lie if it advances the cause of Islam. And of course, they view the United States as the great Satan and an adversary clearly. And so to take them at their face value statements is just beyond unbelievable. And I think, just to put it kindly, is ultra naive. Fox News says Nigel Farage says no way the British Parliament would vote for military cooperation with America under the Biden administration. Nigel Farage, former Brexit Party leader, slammed the Biden administration's Afghanistan's blunder Tuesday, arguing the crisis has led his country of Britain feeling betrayed. Under Biden, Farage told Fox and Friends First that there is no way a British Parliament right now would vote for military cooperation with America. The medium-term problem, he went on to say, is the resurgence of international terror. Already evidence that extremist jihadi groups all over the world have taken great cheer from what the Taliban have done in Afghanistan. And so if we find ourselves back engaged, and, let's be honest, the last few years, we've not seen major terrorist atrocities in the West. He's tipping his hat to Donald Trump. But if they start to happen again, and we start to think, well, how do we go out again and try and stop these cells that are spreading international terror? How can we do that with the Americans? How can we do it with an ally that is treating us with contempt and betrayed us, and into the bargain, many of our own citizens? And certainly if it's a Biden or Harris administration, honestly, there is no way, I repeat, there is no way a British Parliament right now would vote for military cooperation with America led by this administration. And I do believe the right to lie is called tayyib in Islam, and pardon me if that's the wrong word, but it's something similar to that. It just escapes me at the moment. Reuters is also reporting European natural gas supply, gas prices spike to unprecedented levels as Russian supply collapses. Now, our next pair of stories, I want to insert a little bit of scripture here just to keep us tracking with how important this is. And I would say if there's anything we're going to highlight, of course, the Afghan problem is major, obviously news that needs to be paid attention to. But if we're going to look at something through the lens of Bible prophecy and an advancement of the events that are directly related to Bible prophecy, without question, these next two stories would certainly be under that umbrella, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Reuters, as I said, Reports that natural gas prices have spiked to unprecedented levels as the Russian supply has collapsed. 1 week after we first observed the staggering surge in European natural gas prices, those same prices hit a new record high as a slow at first, then much faster tightening of Russian supply looks set to cause a storage crunch on the European continent. Russia gas flows via the Yamal Europe pipeline that runs across Belarus and Poland to Malnau, Germany, have continued to shrink since the start of the month, leaving Europe out of time to refill inventories ahead of the winter. As the chart shows, and there was a picture of a chart, the amount of gas entering Germany at the Malnau compressor station has plunged by almost half, signaling Russia is flowing less through the Yamal Europe in what may be a Kremlin shot across the European bow, and a reminder who's really keeping the lights on during the winter in Europe. And even though Gazprom earlier today said that it was continuing to fulfill its obligations for deliveries via the Yamal Europe gas pipeline and was using all available options to fulfill its obligations, clearly the facts speak otherwise. So what is going on? Well, according to Reuters, 1 week ago, Gazprom suffered a fire at its processing plant in Urengoy, which curbed gas exports via the Yamal Europe pipeline. It also prompted the Russian nat gas giant to cancel gas condensate exports this month. Gazprom said earlier this week it had restarted the Urengoy factory and resumed supplies of condensate, a type of light oil, which is further processed into motor fuels at the Surgut plant, but in smaller volumes. Gazprom typically supplies gas condensate to the domestic market, but plan to export over 100,000 tons of condensate this month during scheduled maintenance at the plant. The article says there will be no exports of condensate in August. So interesting that we see this happening with Russia holding back supply, very possibly and even likely kind of holding a knife to the throat, so to speak, of Europe, telling them to remember where your heat comes from in the winter. It's through the mercies of the Russian leadership and Vladimir Putin and all these other things. And it's certainly not outside the boundaries of thought that this is what's actually going on. Now, another story that pairs with this one, I've combined two stories from Reuters and the Wall Street Journal from August 3rd of 2020. And I did say 2020. Well, I want to reach back a year to make the point from the previous article. The article says, we've been following the development of Israel's natural gas resources for years. And in a rather dramatic fashion, Israel now is pumping natural gas from one of the enormous offshore fields, which will transform Israel into an energy independent nation and a global energy powerhouse. Natural gas from the offshore Tamar field was pumped to Israeli shores for the first time 4 years after its discovery in a preparation for its use in the Israeli energy market, a move that could transform the Israeli economy. The Tamar deposit, discovered in 2009, some 90 kilometers west of Haifa, holds an estimated 8.5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Israel's new offshore fields are enormous, which is part of the reason Turkey has been so belligerent. The Times of Israel reported on December 31st, 2019, that natural gas began flowing from the mammoth Leviathan offshore natural gas field on Tuesday after the government gave a final go-ahead to Noble Energy to forge ahead with the project, despite vocal protests from residents in the coastal region who are concerned about pollution emitted by the rigs. Israel also signed a huge natural gas deal with Greece and Cyprus to ship natural gas to where? To Europe, and commence gas deliveries to Jordan and Egypt. The Israeli government approved an agreement with European countries for the construction of a subsea pipeline that would supply Europe with natural gas from the Eastern Mediterranean. It's called the East Med Pipeline, which has been in planning for several years and is meant to transport gas from offshore Israel and Cyprus to Greece and on to Italy and into the EU beyond that. Now, here's why this is important. We know in Ezekiel 38:13 that Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish and all their young lions of the nations associated with them will say to you, you being Gog, Magog, and the invading nations of Israel, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, and to take away livestock and goods, to take plunder? Sheba and Dedan are the Arab Gulf states, mainly the Saudis, but the other states around it. And the invading forces they are questioning are Russia, Turkey, Iran, Sudan, and Libya. And it's interesting that Turkey was thrown into the article and the angst they have about natural gas production off the Greek Isles and them seeing their own rights to harvest some of this off the coast. But the main thing is, here you've got Russia trying to tighten the noose on the market in Europe, and yet here you've got Israel trying to break into the market and take their own market share from the Russians by their own natural gas fields that have just recently been discovered. Now, could this be the hook in the jaw that draws these invading armies out of the north? Now, we have to remember that 60% of the gross domestic product that comes out of Russia is energy-related products, natural gas, petroleum products, and things of that nature. So to see a rise in price, a spike in price, and to dictate the market, much like OPEC often does with the oil by cutting back on supply, driving the price per barrel up to a comfortable level and profitable level for them, the Russians likely are trying to do the same exact thing. And what would be the worst thing that could happen when you're trying to push a market in a northerly direction, price per cubic foot wise? A competitor. And now here Israel is pushing into that market through an area that there's anxiety from Turkey about the Greek production and it being used as a center for the East Med pipeline reaching into Europe. Russia's trying to control the market and remind the Europeans who keeps them warm in the winter. And well, if that answer shifts to Israel, there could be a problem. Now, again, as we look at Bible prophecy, we have to look at the things happening in the world through the lens of Scripture. We do know all these people are named in Ezekiel 38 and 39. There is no question about that Israel is the target of the invasion, that the invasion comes from the north, the Lebanon border, the Syrian border, obviously on the northern side of Israel. We do know that the reason for the Ezekiel invasion is economic in nature. That's why the protesting nations, Sheba and Dedan, and their young lions, the merchants of Tarshish, their young lions are saying, hey, what are you guys doing? Why are you guys here? But we also need to recognize that there's no voice from America protesting the invasion of Israel. And obviously, in the weakened state that we are in the eyes of the international community, who knows what's going on? I'm with who knows what's going to happen, I should say. But I'm with all of you. My prayer is that why the United States is not in last days Bible prophecy is because the rapture cleans us out from sea to shining sea. And that's not going to happen if we're not out there telling people about Jesus. Now, let's keep moving. Our next story is from the Jewish News Syndicate. Now, here's another interesting story, and I want to share a scripture after this one too, because this story is pointing to a yet future day. And the headline reads from the Jewish News Syndicate, amid regional upheaval, Egypt and Israel seek to strengthen ties and border security. And despite intelligence sharing between the neighboring countries, Cairo has not invited an Israeli prime minister to visit since 2013, the year Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi came to power. And the president invited Prime Minister Naftali Bennett for an official visit in the coming weeks, which would be the first state visit by an Israeli leader in nearly a decade. This invitation, offered last week, comes amid the backdrop of ongoing violence emanating from the Gaza Strip, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, and the ongoing Iranian nuclear threat, which Israel and its Arab regional partners perceive with alarm. Its Arab regional partners. Now, Zivi Matzel, Israel's former ambassador to Egypt and a senior analyst with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, told the Jewish News Syndicate that he views the state visit as a possible sign of warming relations between the countries. And here comes that old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the shared enemy of Iran with Israel and Saudi Arabia, and now Egypt is certainly creating strange bedfellows. But the interesting thing is the Bible has something very strong to say about the Egyptian-Israeli relationship, and I'll share that with you in a moment. While Israel and Egypt have maintained a cold peace since the signing of the Camp David Accords in 78, their mutual ties are largely limited to top government officials and secretive visits. They also both actively work to keep the volatile enclave that it is Gaza and the Hamas terror organization that it runs in check. Now, here's what I think is interesting. Isaiah chapter 19, verses 23 to 25 says, "In that day, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians. In that day, Israel," this is speaking about the millennium, by the way, "Israel will be one of three with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed is," listen to what the Lord is saying, "Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." Listen, here's the interesting thing. Egypt and Assyria are the most ancient and aggressive enemies of Israel in history. And now here you've got the Lord calling Egypt his people, those who held them oppressed and as slaves for 430 years, and Assyria, which was home to Nineveh, where the Lord sent Jonah to preach, and the reluctant preacher finally arrived through a rather interesting mode of transportation. But he did bring the message to the Assyrians, to the great city of Nineveh, 3 days in length, some 75 miles across was the size of Nineveh, and everybody in the country repented, from the king down to the commoner and everybody in between. What was Nineveh's message? 40 days, and yet Nineveh shall be overthrown. That was his whole message, and it led to repentance. That's why we don't shy away from talking about Bible prophecy and last days things, including the wrath of God. The wrath of God is real. He's going to pour out his wrath on this earth for 7 years, and people shy away from this. Christians leave it out of the gospel. But listen, this is part of the gospel message. Jesus is coming soon. He is coming back, and he is coming back first to meet us in the air, born again believers, and then he's coming back with us to rule and reign in righteousness. And he's not coming back as a lamb. He's coming back as the Lion of Judah. And he is going to do these miraculous things, even make ancient enemies beyond friends together, but serve him together collectively. Egypt, my people; Assyria, the work of my hands; Israel, my inheritance. It seems impossible, but if God said it, it's going to happen. Now, Times of Israel is saying, Bennett says, Israel won't annex territory or establish a Palestinian state on my watch. Ahead of his first meeting as prime minister with U.S. President Joe Biden, Naftali Bennett said he would neither annex West Bank territory nor allow it to become a Palestinian state. Bennett told the New York Times in an interview published Tuesday, a day before his arrival in Washington, that the left-to-right composition of his coalition government meant that drastic diplomatic moves in either direction were off the table for now. This government will neither annex nor form a Palestinian state. Everyone gets that, he said. I'm a prime minister of all Israelis, and what I'm doing now is finding the middle ground, how we can focus on what we agree upon. Now, again, if you look at this and the reality that in the last days there's going to be a weakened kind of top-down authority system where major world powers are going to be in a weakened state, it causes people in the world to cry out for peace and security, or peace and prosperity, as Paul wrote in the letter to the Thessalonians. We need to understand that this is part of it. I mean, what Bennett said, it sounds good. You know, we're not going to do anything radical, but you could just end that sentence with, we're not going to do anything, because these issues are the reason for the angst in the Middle East. And in essence, what he just publicly said is, we're not going to do anything about the Middle East crisis. We're just going to mind their own business and try and do things that we all can agree upon, when the problem is that they can't agree upon what is causing all the stress and the turmoil in the Middle East. He did, however, say that Jerusalem would only ever be Israel's capital. That is his one note of stridency in the interview. Now, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, Bennett said. It's not the capital of other nations. Now, that's a strong statement, and that's something that the Bible says too, that Jerusalem, the Lord will always hear prayers made in that place, and that is the city of the people whom he loves. That Daniel was told there are 70 weeks determined for your people in your holy city, which is Jerusalem. Now, in contrast, the Jewish News Syndicate is reporting that the Iranian Ayatollah says the Jews are the greatest problem of Islam and humanity. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's representative in the country's southern Khorasan province, called the Jews humanity's greatest problem in a public address earlier this year. Consider the most difficult problem for Islam and humanity as a whole. This is corroborated by documents. The most difficult problem has been the Jews. Listen to what he says. They are more evil than Satan, said Ayatollah Alireza Ibadi. In a public address aired on Iran's Khorasan Janubi TV on May 7th, Ibadi said that the Jews' ultimate goal was to pillage the entire world. This coming from the group that wants to establish a global caliphate and take over the world. They, the Jews, have taken control of the world in a technical way. They give particular attention to military warfare, propaganda warfare, and psychological warfare. They spread doubt and wage cultural warfare. This is how they can achieve their main goal of pillaging the world, he said. Ibadi went on to claim that the Zionists controlled France and appointed the U.S. president. What a crazy statement that is. The New York Times says, in a shift, Israel quietly allows Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. Now, I mentioned some of these things when Naftali Bennett became the prime minister of Israel, because he has taken a pretty strong stand on some issues regarding the Temple Mount in the past, and I don't find this to be any surprise, but it is a move in the direction we know the world is headed. Like it or not, they may go there kicking and screaming, but there is going to be a third temple on the Temple Mount, and it's not going to be the temple of Jesus. It's not even going to be the temple of the Jews. It's going to be the temple of the Antichrist, if you want to get down to brass tacks about it. He's going to sit in the most holy place and not declare Jehovah to be God or Yahweh or Hashem to be God. He's going to say, I'm God. I am the God that is to be worshipped. The Israeli government, the article says, has long forbidden Jews to pray on the Temple Mount, a site sacred to Jews and Muslims. Let me pause there. Jerusalem is not mentioned in the Quran, not even once. What the Quran does say is that the land of Israel belongs to the people of Moses. Yet Rabbi Yehuda Glick made a little effort to hide his prayers. In fact, he was live streaming them. "Oh Lord," prayed Rabbi Glick as he filmed himself on a phone on a recent morning, "save my soul from false lips and deceitful tongues." And since Israel captured the old city of Jerusalem from Jordan in 1967, it has maintained a fragile religious balance at the Temple Mount, the most divisive site in Jerusalem. Only Muslims can worship there, while Jews can pray at the Western Wall below. But recently, the government has quietly allowed increasing numbers of Jews to pray there, a shift that could aggravate the instability in East Jerusalem and potentially lead to religious conflict. So again, you pair this with what's going on with Israel and the East Med pipeline and Russia trying to control the flow of natural gas into these areas. That is a boom market for them, and their national economy depends upon these types of exports. And Israel now making these moves to supply natural gas into Europe. We see now some more movement on the Temple Mount. We would expect to see things progressing in that direction. We would expect to see people demanding their rights to their most holy site. What the claim is today is that the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, is the third most holy site in Islam. Well, in Judaism, there's only one holy site, and it is the Temple Mount. in Jerusalem. So that in and of itself, besides the centuries and millennia long presence of the Jews in this particular area, means that their arguments, those of the Muslims, are null and void. And yet, with all these things developing, with the nations that are going to invade Israel, many of them with a military presence on the northern border of Israel, one of my favorite sayings is keep looking up. Jesus is coming soon. We can't lose sight of the fact that the Bible has told us all of these things in advance. As disheartening as they may be, as discouraging as times may be, the Bible said perilous times are coming, and they'll come in the last days because of a major group of character flaws, including being traitors and headstrong and haughty, is what Paul said. Even having a form of godliness, but denying its power. And now here we see Jews praying on the Temple Mount. And Ehud Olmert, former Israeli prime minister, said it is a sensitive place. And sensitive places such as this, which have an enormous potential for explosion, need to be treated with care. Rabbi Glick, an American-born right-wing former lawmaker, has been leading efforts to change the status quo for decades. He characterizes his efforts as a matter of religious freedom. If Muslims can pray there, why can't Jews? God is the master of all humanity, he said, and he wants every one of us to be here to worship, everyone in his own style. But the prohibition of Jewish prayer on the 37-acre plateau that once held two ancient Jewish temples was part of a long-standing compromise to avoid conflict at the site that has been a frequent flashpoint in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, here's some news. We're going to turn back to Afghanistan, but we're also turning the corner, so to speak, on our subject here. And Christian Today reports that 1,200 Christians have been evacuated from Afghanistan. Get this, through donor-funded rescue missions. The government isn't getting our citizens out of there exclusively. 1,200 Christians have been evacuated from people donating money to get them out. This article quotes conservative radio host Glenn Beck, who says 1,200 Christians have been rescued from Afghanistan in a donor-funded evacuation, a fundraiser launched by the Blaze founder, who has raised over $28 million to get Americans out of Afghanistan. And speaking on the Blaze, he said some of that included a loan he had signed for personally and a significant donation given by journalist and TV host Bill O'Reilly. In an Instagram update, Beck said a third plane full of evacuees had taken off on Tuesday. Now, 1,200 Christians have been flown to safety. It's been a good day, he wrote. He went on to say, thank you for the outpouring of prayers and support. Because of the power of the people, we will live. He added, America does care. America does not leave her own and the most vulnerable behind. We can do this as the power is with the people, he went on to say. We are America, not our government. When they can't do it, private citizens step up to the plate. Now, there is an element of this that I think we all need to recognize, and that is our responsibility to care and watch out for one another and to stand when no one else will. And if there is anything that describes the Christian faith and activity in a world such as this, it is being willing to stand up for those who can't stand for themselves. And that would include the unborn, those who are caught up in sex trafficking, and all the other things, the heinous things going on in our world today. We, the body of Christ, need to be involved in rescuing them, both their souls and their bodies. This is an important element, I think, that often gets lost of. Now, our next article comes from Big League Politics, and this, again, is stuff comes under the boy that aggravates me file. Big League Politics says California bill seeks jail time for people who protest vaccination sites, including at hospitals. A bill in the California legislature seeks to ban anti-vaccine protests outside of vaccination sites, including hospitals and doctors' offices. Protesters would face, get this, for protesting a vaccine. Protesters would face 6 months of imprisonment and a fine if the bill passes into law. Freedom protesters, including doctors and nurses, have been peacefully demonstrating outside of hospitals recently, sparking panic among a globalist medical class that pushes the vaccination agenda at all cost. Can patriots in California stop the Senate bill SB 742 and protect some semblance of free speech in the Golden State? Well, on August 19th, SB 742 was placed in the legislature's suspense file category, which means the bill will be considered at a later date in a rapid fire process alongside other bills that have been placed in the file for being fiscally significant to the state. And in other words, it's going to be tucked away in the midst of other things to get fast tracked through. And next thing you know, it potentially could be law. This goes on to say, according to the penal code in section 594.39, it is unlawful to knowingly approach within 30 feet of any person while a person is making the approach within 100 feet of the entrance of a vaccination site and is seeking to enter or exit a vaccination site. Meaning, if you're against the vaccines, you can't even go near a person who's going in or coming from one of these places or interfering with that person or vehicle occupant in connection with any vaccination services. This is punishable by a fine not exceeding $1,000 and imprisonment in the county jail not exceeding 6 months. So you can go to jail for 6 months and face $1,000 fine for protesting against something that has killed thousands of people, even though, the positive side is a reality too. We don't want to diminish that. But it's just amazing to see what's happening in our world. The government is taking over, just as the Bible has predicted in the last days, leading up to a time where people will be willing to submit their freedoms for the sake of conducting business under the Antichrist and take a mark on their hand or forehead, which is not the vaccine. The vaccine is not the mark of the beast. How do I know? There's no beast. The beast comes out during the tribulation only, not now. But that doesn't mean that this isn't playing into the mentality that would accept the mark in order to buy business. And it's basically normalizing this type of action on the part of government leaders. Now, here's another story that's going to aggravate us all. American News reports a Washington State school, forces student athletes to wear ankle monitors for the purpose of COVID segregation. COVID segregation. A 15-year-old girl was allegedly forced to wear an ankle tracking monitor for volleyball practice at Eatonville High School in Washington State as a condition of participating in team sports. This was required initially of both the vaccinated and unvaccinated students. And according to her mother, her daughter was at practice for the public school's volleyball team and texted her that she was being asked to put on an ankle monitor. The team didn't answer the mother's follow-up texts or calls. The mother assumed she was playing during practice, attempted to contact the school via phone. No one at the school was able to answer her questions about the monitor, so she drove to the building. And the student was told to take off the trace tag device, which was created for the purpose of maintaining social distancing guidelines and to provide real-time insights into whether these guidelines are being observed. The devices provide, according to the article, a visual and audible alarm, so individuals know when to adjust their current distance to a proper social distance. Again, the monitors provide passive collection of worker interactions for contact tracing should an individual test positive. In other words, they're going to tell you if somebody is tested positive who is near you. And there's a trace tag device called a Triax that has been manufactured for this very purpose. Man, it's just getting crazier and crazier out there. Now, here's another story that I'd like to mention because we do know, as I've said many times, there's going to be cosmological events that take place during the tribulation. As the prophets have told us, the stars will be shaken and everything moved out of its place, as Isaiah said, and Revelation records. And the Daily Star says an enormous asteroid, double the size of the Empire State Building, is going to enter Earth's orbit. NASA has been tracking asteroid 2010 RJ53 as part of their efforts to defend the Earth against a doomsday collision, and it will be flying into our orbit next month. An enormous asteroid, roughly twice the size of the Empire State Building, is currently hurtling towards Earth's orbit, and it's been tracked, as we said. And this comes days after it was announced that a slightly smaller asteroid will enter our atmosphere on Sunday. It spans roughly 2,540 feet or 774 meters and should fly past us on September 9th. RJ53 circles between 58 and 139 million miles from the sun and will whiz by the Earth at a distance of more than 2 million miles. And a serious asteroid impact remains one of the worst possible natural disasters, as there is very little we can do to stop one, the article says. Now, again, I point this out not because we're in danger of this particular asteroid, 2010 RJ53, but it just reminds us these things pop up out of nowhere, and we don't have to be seeing signs of these things to be fulfilled during the tribulation. There's not a gradual move toward these things, but I'd like to remind you of these stories because there is going to be something, a great mountain burning with fire that falls into the sea, as well as a star that falls to the earth. But now we know that's not an actual star. Stars are way bigger than the earth, and their heat would consume the earth when it got within millions and millions of miles. So it's simply a heavenly body that crashes into the earth, poisoning the freshwater drinking supply. So just these things coming in, and 2010 being the year this was discovered, obviously, but also there was just one that was found last Sunday that is slightly smaller. That's a big rock, some 774 meters across. That is something that would cause or wreak some havoc. So again, this just reminds us about these things that are part of the last days scenario. Now, we also know that during the tribulation period, under the four horsemen of the apocalypse, that the beasts of the earth are going to turn on humanity and each other because of the short food supply and the things that are coming upon the earth. Now, I thought this story was interesting because it's just a reminder of that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a precursor to that, but it could be, because Earth Chronicles is reporting there is strange coyote behavior that is being recorded in Canada. Vancouver coyotes are attacking people in Stanley Park. They're biting their own tails, and biologists don't understand why. Vancouver coyote experts are using every tactic possible, not including catapults and dynamite, to try and solve the mystery of why these animals have attacked dozens of people in Stanley Park this year. There may not be more than a dozen coyotes living in a 4 square mile park in Vancouver, but they have provincial and city employees chasing their tails in search of answers as to why the animals are all of a sudden so aggressive. At the same time, the call to rid the park of coyotes is growing louder after nearly 40 cases have been reported since December 2020 of animals either biting or showing aggression toward everyone from seniors to toddlers. And Paul Curtis, a professor and wildlife expert at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, has spent decades studying coyote aggression. His research, conducted in the New York City parks 15 years ago, showed that people feeding animals that are territorial can cause the most aggression. However, this says there's been an unprecedented number of attacks and other strange animal behaviors. But he couldn't think of any other examples of the dozens of coyote attacks within 8 months. So who knows whether this has anything to do with what's coming or the shortness of habitat for them or whatever it may be. Who knows? But interesting to read such a story. Now, here's another story, and this one I think again kind of piques our interest, and it is about the vaccine and all the things we've been hearing about it. And this is from the NUC report, the News Opinions and Questions report. 155,000 hospitalized for vaccine effects, and why our government is hiding this fact. And this article is written by Dr. Singleton, who is a member of the American Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. In Patrick Henry's June 4, 1788 speech, "A wrong step now and the republic will be lost forever," he pleaded for less power to the federal government and the preservation of states and individual rights as a condition for the ratification of the Constitution. We have our Bill of Rights, including freedom of religion, speech, assembly, and to petition the governments for a redress of grievances. We also have the right to secure in our persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. And we cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And despite the Constitution's admonitions, fear and anxiety have led to an increase in federal powers. The Great Depression gave birth to some 70 new government agencies and programs. The mother of all programs was the Social Security Act, constitutionally justified under Congress' constitutional taxing power. We have been so irrational as to deem it constitutional to place American citizens in internment camps with no due process, and COVID 19 is the latest justification for government overreach in the name of public health. There is little reason for confidence given the CDC's faulty COVID 19 tests, the conflicting information on the uselessness of wearing masks, and censoring of effective treatments that were not on the infallible Dr. Fauci's personal favorite list. Note, the World Health Organization recommended against the use of his favorite drug, remdesivir. And according to the erosion of trust is the change in a definition of COVID-19 case. Listen to this. Prior to the vaccination rollout, any positive COVID-19 test with or without symptoms was a case. Now, a positive test in a vaccinated person is only considered a case if the person is vaccinated or died. And the federal health bureaucracy is encouraging businesses and local governments to mandate vaccines despite the growing list of adverse effects, their modest effectiveness against the predominant Delta variant, and the imminent need for booster shots. According to data gathered from the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System run by the CDC as of August 23, 2021, again, according to the CDC's own website, there have been 13,068 deaths, 154,142 hospitalizations, 5,617 cases of anaphylaxis, 4,681 cases of Bell's palsy, 1,607 miscarriages, 4,861 cases of myocarditis and pericarditis, myocarditis, 13,812 life-threatening reactions, and 17,228 permanently disabled, among other issues. On one hand, it is arguable that this is a pittance given that 360,634,287 doses of Pfizer, Moderna, or Johnson & Johnson vaccines have been given. On the other hand, a Harvard 2011 study concluded that only 1% of adverse vaccine reactions are ever reported to the governmental system. So again, we're seeing problems with this, and yet it's being forced upon us, and your will is being overridden by the government. The Daily Expose from the UK says, listen to this article. Oxford University study finds fully vaccinated healthcare workers carry 251 times the viral load compared to the unvaccinated, proving that COVID-19 vaccinations make you worse. A groundbreaking preprint paper by the prestigious Oxford University Clinical Research Group published August 10th in the Lancet Journal, which was created, a medical and science journal created in 1823, kind of viewed as the gold standard of medical journals, includes alarming findings devastating to the COVID vaccine rollout. The study found vaccinated individuals carry 251 times the load of COVID-19 viruses in their nostrils compared to the unvaccinated. While moderating the symptoms of infection, the jab allows vaccinated individuals to carry unusually high viral loads without becoming ill at first, potentially transforming them into pre-symptomatic super spreaders. This phenomenon may be the source of the shocking post-vaccination surges in heavily vaccinated populations globally. The paper's authors demonstrated widespread vaccine failure and transmission under the tightly controlled circumstances in a hospital lockdown in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Now, again, we're seeing so many reports like this. And as I reported earlier, I think it was last week, one of the things that we have to pay attention to is when the most or the highest percentage demographic of people who are against the vaccine are people with PhDs. That tells us that there's a matter of concern and that we're not being told everything. Now, again, One of the things that I want to highlight here is because the social media platforms are censoring actual facts. But let me just say this, if they start censoring information that comes from the Lancet Journal, that proves they don't care anything about people. All they care about is their ideology and advancing their causes. Because the truth is, the reason that they're carrying a heavier viral load in their nostrils is because the vaccine does not create IgA antibodies that kill the virus while it's in your nose and mouth only come from an actual natural infection. The vaccines, none of them create IgA antibodies. They only create IgG antibodies, which defends the lungs and the chest cavity and all the other things we see going on. So it only makes sense that it would carry a heavier viral load in the mouth or the nose because there's no protection there. There's no antibodies to fight it. Now, they would become symptomatic, obviously, when other things began to develop and the virus would breach and get down into their lung system and circulate throughout their whole body. So, there is cause for concern, and yet here we are. We've got an agenda being forced upon us, and people have taken vaccines for years and years and years, 100 years. We've had vaccines that have helped us greatly, and there's always been side effects to it. But the fact of the matter is, this thing was rushed to market. There have been no long-term studies because COVID has not been with us long enough for there to be long-term studies. And I think we would all have a little more confidence in those in places of power if they would just be honest about what's going on and give us the real data instead of never, ever mentioning the benefit of natural immunities. And the natural immunities are the strongest immunities because they protect your nose and mouth where viruses first penetrate the body. So this comes from the Lancet Journal. This comes from doctors, and doctors all over the world are saying the same thing. There was a French Nobel laureate who has been saying actually the vaccine spreads the virus. The vaccine is the reason we're seeing this happen because of that one particular aspect in the nose and mouth. That's where the virus gets spread. It's aerosol. When you sneeze, when you cough, when you speak, do anything that aggressively requires, like singing, as they've said, that requires more air and aerosol particles coming out of your mouth. When you've got a 261% heavier viral load, then you're going to infect other people. And this is caused, again, by the vaccine. So let's just keep our heads together and remember Jesus is coming for us. And someday we're going to be with him forever. And he said things are going to be a mess before I do come for you. And the world is going to be filled with peril, and there all are going to be rising wars, rumors of wars, famines, pestilence, and seismological and atmospheric events. And they're all leading up to the tribulation period. We're seeing everything happening that the Bible says is going to happen in the last days, including the things pertaining to the nation of Israel. Now, people often ask, are we in the tribulation now? No. The tribulation is the 70th week of Daniel, period. It's the 70th week of Daniel. 69 weeks have been fulfilled. The 70th is yet to come. And remember, Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 2 that the lawless one cannot be revealed until the hindering force of the Spirit working through the church is taken out of the way. The first thing that happens in the tribulation, the Antichrist rides onto the world scene, the first of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, riding on a white horse with a bow in his hand, symbolic of a covenant that he makes with Israel for 7 years. None of that's happened. It can't happen till we're gone. So don't lose hope, and certainly don't stop or slow down telling people about Jesus because our message is not well received. The church has always been under fire. The church has always, to a degree, somewhere in the world, but certainly in the first century, been on the run. But the church has always, in times of persecution, continued to grow. So let's keep the faith and not lose hope. Jesus is coming for us soon. Well, that's it for this week. Encourage you once again, if you'd like to join the fun on Telegram or follow, I would ask that you would subscribe to our YouTube page. You can find it under just my name, or you can find it under The Truth About God, and stay on top of what's happening message-wise, as well as updates and things of that nature on YouTube. We're still being heavily restricted on Facebook, but some of you are out there sharing and thankful for that and getting the word out about what's happening from the Word of God and what's happening in the world. So, with that, I'm out. God bless you. And as we've been saying of late, we'll see you here, there,